Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Robert J. Miller. Professor Robert Miller is a professor of religious studies and Christianity at Juniata College in Pennsylvania. Christian thought at Juniata College. Just want to correct that. He is the editor of the Complete Gospels and the author of Born Divine, The Births of Jesus and Other Sons of God. He also wrote Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy, which is the center of today's topic. And he was once a member of the Jesus Seminar. Welcome to the show, Professor Miller.
Thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's get right into it.
Okay.
What is the book Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy about? What is the general idea of it?
The general idea is to look at the ways in which New Testament authors use biblical prophecies found in what Christians call the Old Testament, and how they are able to relate those to the life and deeds of Jesus. And in some cases, these authors have helped Jesus fulfill prophecy through various ways in which they manipulate the words of those prophecies, sometimes by slightly altering them, oftentimes by quoting them out of context, sometimes by combining them, different verses, and to make new ones which don't really exist in any one place. And so we see with the New Testament authors a fairly creative use of biblical prophecy to help them present Jesus as one who fulfills prophecy. And as I begin to track that down, it's not too hard to get started in this work. All you have to do is really look at the New Testament passage and then compare that with the Old Testament prophecy that it is quoting. And oftentimes you can see for yourselves that some of these things have changed. And as I begin to dig a little deeper, I begin to find out that everybody in the ancient world was treating old prophecies this way. They are being very creative in their uses and finding rather ingenious ways to make these old words from the prophets from the past relate to the present. So that's was really a very interesting track to follow, and I thought I could do that relatively quickly, but it took over 400 pages, and that's how things go once you begin to follow these pathways.
When you say that Jesus needs help fulfilling prophecy, are we talking about scenarios like what some will refer to as failed prophecy? Jesus was to be called Emmanuel, but he wasn't, or he predicted something that didn't really happen, or this or that.
Yeah, those do occur. They're relatively rare. I'm going to give some examples. People can see in an up-close way how these authors went about their work. But it's very clear that they simply didn't look up these Old Testament passages or even remember them and write them down as they were found in the text. They were manipulated. And by manipulated, I don't mean deceitful. I mean that they were actually moving them around, treating them as kind of a raw material from which to fashion a prophecy which would make sense when applied to the life of Jesus.
So here you get into the Dead Sea Peshers.
Well, let's back up a little bit about that. Can we go to the top of that page?
Oh yeah, 1 second. Getting back to it. Okay.
Yeah, I first want to talk about two really interesting distinctions. First, past and present in the Bible. And of course, the reason people seek out scriptures in any religion is that they believe they have something to say to them, some message which will address their present situation, give them guidance, give them inspiration, help them have laws to live by, etc. And that's been the way in which, of course, Christians and Jews have read the Bible through almost their entire history. A very recent development in the history of Christianity has been what we call the academic study of the Bible, or the historical critical study of the Bible, which the interest is not primarily in what the Bible can say to us today, but what it meant to the people back then. So that is interested in the past. And so it's not really interested in how to understand our place in the biblical story, but rather simply to take the text in its own way. And that's the approach that biblical scholars take. And it's interesting to see how that past and present sort of play off against one another. Ancient Jews and Christians developed very interesting and sometimes quite sophisticated methods by which they could enable these words from the past to relate to their present. And those were not academic as we understand them, but they were, to their minds, faithful to their revelation from the past. The other distinction I want to bring up is the different ways in which prophecy is understood in Israel and in Greece, because what we see in the New Testament is a combination of both approaches. Both of these cultures have influenced very strongly the way in which the authors of the New Testament were understanding and treating the biblical text. So to make things a little more simple than they really are, but just to be helpful, that when prophets announced God's words to the people of their own time, they were talking to the people of their own time about their own situation. Now, occasionally they would refer to the future, usually the future which was going to be very soon or very imminent, usually with the interest of warning the people that if they didn't change their ways, the future would be bad, and promising them that if they did live according to God's will, their future would turn out well. So the whole thing is meant to be clear to people. The prophets took great pains to be clear in their communications, and that's essentially their goal. Now, the Greeks, who are not part of the biblical story, of course, they had a very different idea about what prophets did. To them, prophecy was all future telling, fortune telling, as it turned out. And the meaning of these prophecies in ancient Greece was intended to be mysterious. It was very seldom clear what these things meant, and oftentimes their meaning would become clear only much, 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 much later, when people could look back and say, oh, that's what that prophecy was about. Now, the land of Israel had been occupied by Greek government, by Greek culture, by Greek political reign since the time of Alexander the Great. So by the time of the New Testament writers begin writing, that Greek influence has been around for 400 years. And what they're picking up then is looking at the prophecies or the books of Jewish prophecy with a fairly Greek outlook. And we'll see how that influences things a bit later. The thing that's important to point out is that for Israel, the future is not set in concrete, right? It's usually a matter of the prophets giving people a choice. Here's the way God wants you to go. If you do, things will turn out well. If you don't, things will turn out quite badly. In Greece, the future was locked in by this mysterious power that they call fate, and not even the gods could change that. And that has a lot to do then with how these two different cultures understood what their prophecies were all about. So you want to ask a question, or shall I just plow ahead to this stuff about the Dead Sea?
My question was going to be about the Dead Sea, Pesher, so go ahead.
Okay, the Dead Sea community was a very odd, I mean, by any standard, very strange sect of Jewish people living out by the Dead Sea in South Israel. And they adopted a, shall I say, sort of non-mainstream form of Judaism. They were also very interested in the Jewish Bible, and they produced a vast number of writings and texts, some of which are commentaries on what these old books say. And there's a very specific kind of way in which these some of these Dead Sea writings interpret prophecy. And the name scholars give to that is pesher. Pesher is just the Aramaic word that means interpretation. But it refers to a specific kind of writing in which an author will quote a short expression from the past, from the prophecies or from the law or something like that. And then we'll say, and this is what it means, right? So here's the quotation and here's the interpretation. And when we look at the way they're doing that, we sometimes see it's very clear that they're reading these prophecies as coming true in their own experience, in their own time. Their belief in among the Dead Sea Jews was that all of the history of Israel was building up to their times and to them, because they thought of themselves as really the only real, authentic, faithful Israelites. Somewhat the same way as many small sects of Christians think that only they are really Christians and everybody else is somehow not got the complete faith. I just chosen two out of many, many, many of these comments on the prophets, so we can see the unusual way in which these are interpreted. And the first one there is from the prophet Nahum, and it's a very brief sentence, and it says, "He roars against the sea and dries it up." Now that doesn't make a prediction, doesn't seem to be about anything people will do or not. It's simply a way to poetically describe the immense power of God. But at the Dead Sea, in this Pesher, it says its interpretation. This is what it means, that the sea is a reference to the Kittim. And the Kittim was their name for the Romans. Now, you can see how, from our point of view, how artificial that is and how it seems arbitrary that is. You can also see how it is a way in which they found a prophecy and were able to relate it to their own time simply by saying, well, sea doesn't really mean the ocean. It really means the Romans. And the Romans were powerful because they had a navy, so it kind of fits in that sense. And here we see this declaration then would be that God is against the Romans. God is against us. I mean, against our enemies. We're against the Romans, so God is on our side. A second interpretation, or a second Pesher, has to do with this rather famous quotation from the prophet Habakkuk. It's famous because Paul quotes it and does a great deal with it. It simply says, "The righteous shall live by faith." And again, that doesn't seem to be a prophecy about the future. It's simply an expression of what righteous people do, is they live by their faith. And you see how we get a very complicated interpretation that follows because of this. It says, well, interpreted, this concerns all those who observe the law in the house of Judah, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering and because of their faith in the teacher of righteousness. You notice that faith here does not refer, they say, to faith in God, but to faith in this figure called the teacher of righteousness, which was the title they gave to the founder and leader of their community, whose name we don't know. All we know is that he was known as, probably called himself, the teacher of righteousness. So this has become a very specific, in their minds at least, very specific reference to their specific community. That righteous people follow our leader and no one else. So you see, you're in a very, anybody I think with a fair-minded reading would say these are forced interpretations, right? There's no way that Nahum, writing, some 7 centuries before their time, would have thought about this being about the Romans. And certainly Habakkuk wasn't talking about this obscure teacher of righteousness living out on the edge of the desert in Israel some 8 centuries after his time. So this is one of the ways in which ancient Jews were in the process of reinterpreting their own scriptures to make them refer to things which were happening in their own time and in their own experience. And that's the kind of spirit that gets picked up by the authors of the New Testament. They don't do Pesher, they don't do it quite this way, but some of their interpretations are clearly an attempt to make sort of sentences or proclamations by the prophets, which would seem to have nothing to do with later on sure enough, they can find a way to make it speak to their time, to their experience of Jesus and the community of those who follow him.
When these prophecies were written down in the New Testament, do you think that the authors that wrote these texts were familiar with not just the obviously not just the they obviously are familiar with the Old Testament and the prophecies there, but what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Do you think they knew about them too?
Oh, yes, they did, and we know that for a fact because they copied them. Many of what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Jewish scriptures. So they were very, very interested in writing things out. They were very literate people. They had apparently some kind of library.
No, that's not what I was asking. I was asking if the New Testament authors were familiar with what the Dead Sea Scrolls were saying.
I know. It's hard to know, but there's certainly no indication that they've been influenced by them, if they were.
Let's get to the next page.
Okay.
So yeah, how did they help Jesus fulfill prophecy? What
go ahead. Well, they helped in a number of ways. One of the ways in which they did was by very carefully quoting out of context, lifting a certain phrase, even sometimes a certain word from an Old Testament prophecy or Old Testament text, and very carefully not giving you the rest of the verse. Because if the whole verse was described, then it would be very clear that it could not apply in the way that the New Testament author intends. So here's an interesting example here from Paul, and he has this quotation from Galatians, from the letter to the Galatians. It has to do with God's promise to Abraham in Genesis. And so I'm quoting now, as you can see, from Galatians. And Paul says, well, the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed. And by that, we know he means offspring. Okay. It does not say and to seeds as of many, but it says into your seed, that is one person. That is Christ. Now, if you stand back a little bit, this is a very odd thing to claim, because what it's claiming is that God's promises to Abraham were not for the people of Israel, not for Abraham's descendants. They were for one person and one person only. That, when you think about it, that's a very odd thing to believe. And Paul is very specific here. He says, look, that the text in Genesis here that he's quoting does not say seeds plural, as if it referred to many. It says to seed singular, and the Greek term there is sperma, seed. And that's what allows him then, this applies to one person who is Christ. Now that's that's quoted from Genesis chapter 12. If you look at other places in the book of Genesis that use the word seed in the singular, you will see that each time it refers to many people. For instance, in Genesis 15:5, God tells Abraham to count the stars. He says, if you can. God then tells him, so will be your seed, singular. Your seed will be as many as the stars. And then again, in Genesis 17, verses 4 and 7, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you through their generations. Again, it's perfectly obvious that seed, even though it's used in the plural, refers to all the people of Israel in all of their multitude. And if you scroll down one more time here, a bit more, Jacob, we can see the rest of this.
Yep, doing so now.
Yeah, there's two more things I want to look at here in the way in which this is being used in Genesis. There it is. It's again in Genesis 22, God says, I will make your seed as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand of the seashore. So when Paul says that the reason it says seed singular and not seeds plural, that it refers to one person, well, that's not what Genesis means when it uses seed. And Paul knows that. He knows that. He knows that the singular seed refers to many people because just a few verses later in Galatians 3:29, he says, if you belong to Christ, then you, plural, and in the Greek language, you is different. Yeah, when it refers to one you and a plural you. In English, we have the same word, but in Greek, they're different. If you belong to Christ, then you, plural, are Abraham's seed, singular. You are heirs according to his promise. So this is a clear indication that Paul knows that he's making this word mean something it simply doesn't mean in its context in the book of Genesis. So this is one way in which Paul is helping Jesus fulfill this prophecy by this very, very careful selective quotation. Let me give an example from the Gospels here. In Matthew, in the scene after which Jesus is a baby and King Herod is out to kill Jesus but doesn't know who he is exactly and decides he's just going to kill every baby in the region. And Joseph finds out about this from an angel who appears to him in a dream. And Joseph flees to Egypt with Mary and Joseph. And then Matthew stops the story and tells us this was to fulfill the prophecy. I called my son out of Egypt. And clearly, Matthew is indicating that my son is a reference to Jesus, or else how else would it be being fulfilled? This is unusual in a couple of ways. One way is that Jesus is not fleeing out of Egypt, but rather to Egypt. But that's probably just a quibble, and I'm not going to worry about that one. What I am worried about, though, is the way that Matthew has quoted half of this saying from the prophet. When we look the prophecy up in the prophet Hosea, we see that he says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. I called my son out of Egypt. It's perfectly clear. And Hosea tells us that Israel refers to all the people of Israel, not to a specific person who's going to be born many, many centuries later. In fact, I call my son out of Egypt is not a prediction. It's a recollection of a past event. And then as we read on in the prophecy, I called my son out of Egypt, and the more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. So you can see why Matthew won't quote the entire verse. If he does, it's perfectly clear it does not and cannot possibly refer to Jesus, because Jesus is not the people of Israel, and nor did Jesus go off and sacrifice to the Baals, etc. And so to make this work for Jesus, to help Jesus fulfills it, Matthew has to very carefully just cut this thing out of its context and of almost a surgical precision. So that's one way in which our prophets help Jesus fulfill prophecy, because without their help here, without their quotation, clearly Jesus would not be able to be the referent of this prophecy, because in their own context, these prophecies cannot refer to a singular person, much less somebody coming along many, many centuries later. So let's get one more example of this from the Gospel of John, just to give a sample of a very large number of these. But I've just chosen 3 because they're relatively easy to see. So if you would advance this, Jacob, to the next bit about John's Gospel. Yeah, now here's one again that you see a very careful selective quotation. You also see that this is not a prediction about anything. This is a statement about what's going on at the time or what went on in the past. It comes at the end of a rather lengthy time, a whole paragraph in which Jesus is speaking in John chapter 15, describing, and in the night before he dies, he describes in detail how what he calls the world and people he calls the Jews hate him. And that word is used quite specifically. They hate him. And then John tells us that Jesus says, this fulfills the prophecy. They hated me for no reason. When you look that prophecy up in the book of Psalms, you see here, it says, more than the number of the hairs of my head are those who hate me for no reason. In the next verse, it says, oh God, you know my foolishness. The wrongs I have done are not hidden from you. So once again, you have a smoking gun here of selective quotation. The New Testament author has snipped out with great precision those words that he could make refer to Jesus only by pulling them out of their original context. Now, there's many more examples of this in the New Testament. They're all, I churn through all of them in my book, but these are, I think, pretty easy to see that Jesus needed help fulfilling these prophecies, because without the rather careful manipulation that the New Testament authors give to these prophecies, they simply wouldn't refer to him at all. So let me pause here just to see if there's any things you want to bring up, Jacob, or any questions that you think this might raise for our listeners.
Do you think that that Jesus' followers during Jesus' lifetime actually believed that he was the Messiah? And were they already connecting him to some of these prophecies that we see here? Or do you think a lot of that took place after his crucifixion?
I think it all took place after his crucifixion, and the Gospels tell us so. We're gonna see in just a short time here, just later in the podcast, places in the Gospels where it's very clear, and the Gospel writers tell us that at the time, nobody understood that he was fulfilling prophecy. It was only later, after he'd been raised from the dead, that they begin to see these connections. And that's a very telling thing to say. And it actually confirms, a major argument I'm making in the book is that people did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah because he fulfilled prophecy. They believed that he fulfilled prophecy because they believed he was the Messiah. So the arrow is pointing not from the prophecies to Jesus, right? The way in which they're reasoning, that's how they appear in the text, but the way in which the followers of Jesus reason is, now that we know that Jesus is the promised Messiah, we also know that he must have been predicted by the prophets, and so they can go hunting for verses that would bring this up. This one we just looked at in John's Gospel, they hated me for no reason. You'd have no reason to think that was a prediction of anything, much less a prediction of Jesus, just by going through your life, because a lot of people get hated for no reason. It doesn't single Jesus out as being anything special. But after he died, then as they begin to think and read, some of the John and Gospel writers are very careful readers, read these prophecies very closely, looking for anything that they can use. And if it needs to be lifted out of context, well, that's what it takes. Now, I want to emphasize that from our perspective, this is intellectual dishonesty. Certainly, if I see my students quoting out of context in which they give the impression that an author means something opposite from what the author actually means in the author's own context, yeah, that's unfair, and that's dishonest. That's our perspective. In the ancient world, they did not think that way, and that was a big eye-opener for me. They seem to have believed that somehow these words were like Greek prophecies, obscure and cryptic and coded. And it was only much later that they could look back and see their true meaning, which may not mean their literal reading, but their true, their deeper, their spiritual significance. And so that's what I think is moving, just like the people who wrote the Peshers at the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that's what's kind of the impulse for this, is to look back and find places where things are going. Jacob, all I can see now is the text. Is my face on the screen? I'm not clear at this point. Okay.
Well, we haven't finished going through this yet.
Oh, sure.
Our pages will return when we're
Okay.
done with this.
Now, in addition to quoting out of context, it's a process that I call retrofitting, and that's a term from building or engineering, when you have a part that's made to do something, and then later you fix it, you adapt it to make it do something that it wasn't originally intended to do. So like if you retrofit your heating system for solar power, you would, it's intended to run on gas or oil or something like that, but you can retrofit it in this new way. And that's a term just occurred to me as very apt here, in which these prophecies will be reworded to make them better apply to Jesus. And I've got a few examples of this. I think these are also easy to see. There's a lot of that going on in the New Testament, but here I'm just going to look at two examples because our time is brief. This first one comes a very famous prophecy quoted by the gospel writer Matthew. And it's after Jesus learns in a dream that Mary is pregnant before she and Joseph are living together. And Matthew tells her that this fulfills this prophecy. It's a very complicated prophecy because this word parthenos, which has been, I think, mistranslated as virgin, has a long history in Christian interpretation. But I want to focus not on that, but in the second phrase of the sentence. It says, the virgin, or parthenos, which means young woman, will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel. The actual prophecy says that you, singular, will name him Emmanuel. And this is a prophecy addressed to King Ahaz, that he's going to have a son, and you, Ahaz, will name him Emmanuel. So you can see that Matthew has very carefully changed the singular you to the plural they. And you wonder, well, why would he do that? Why make this very specific and, again, somewhat surgical alteration in the original wording of the prophecy? Well, it's pretty obvious that Jesus was not called Emmanuel by anybody. He was named Jesus. That's what the angel told Joseph to name the boy. Name him Jesus. So what Matthew does, knowing that he was not given the name Emmanuel, he changes this to they will name him Emmanuel. And it's very fascinating, and I think quite ingenious, and actually quite a beautiful way, actually, because in the very end of Matthew's gospel, the very last verse, when Jesus is addressing, after his resurrection, his followers, right? He says, I will be with you always, even to the end of the ages. And this word, Emmanuel, means God with us. It means God is with us. And so I think Matthew is signaling to us in the final verse of his gospel that Jesus is with us, and Jesus' presence among us will be the sign that God is with us. And so it is then appropriate that his followers, Christians, will name him God is with us, even though that was not the name that he carried during his own lifetime on earth among his people. So this is a way in which Matthew has fine-tuned the prophecy to make it serve the specific needs of his own gospel and to make it applicable to Jesus. Because if you, Joseph, will name him Emmanuel. If that was the prophecy, then it was not fulfilled because Joseph named him Jesus, just as the angel instructed. Okay, now just one more example, a little less freighted, but nonetheless pretty interesting. In 2 Corinthians, Paul describes how believers belong to God, and that one of he has a list of prophecies that he says this fulfills, and one of them, he says, is God's declaration that I will be a father to you, plural, and you, plural, will be sons and daughters to me. One of the rare places in the New Testament where we're being gender inclusive, not just sons, but sons and daughters. I will be a father to you, to you all, and you all will be sons and daughters to me. The actual prophecy does not use plural. The actual prophecy is spoken to David when he describes that David will have a son, and the prophet tells David, speaking for God, thus says God, he says, thus says the Lord, I will be a prophet to him. He's referring to David's son, Solomon, and he will be a son to me. This is a reference to the belief that ancient Israelites believed that the kings were kind of like adopted sons of God because they had special duties of obedience to God's law, and because they were, empowered to speak or act on God's behalf the way a son would act on behalf of a father. So he says, I will be a father to him. And he obviously and clearly means King Solomon, and he will be a son to me. So you see how Paul knows about this verse, obviously, and simply changes it. Changes the him to you, plural, and changes son to sons and daughters, so that this can be more properly and more fully fulfilled. Another clear example of a prophecy from the past being retrofitted or tuned up or redone to make it more appropriate for the context in the New Testament. Okay, finally then, to address this issue here of retrospection, and you might want to scroll up to pull in the full quotation here from John. That, as I said earlier, the belief that Jesus fulfills prophecy is something which early Christians arrived at by looking back at the time in which Jesus was among them. There seemed to be no evidence that they're saying, oh, look, he's fulfilling this prophecy or he's fulfilling that prophecy. It's something that they understood after the whole story had finished. So Jacob, if you would scroll up on this quotation here from John's Gospel. Okay, this is about Jesus riding into Jerusalem. You probably know this story, the story that Christians commemorate on Palm Sunday. The next day, huge crowds come out to the festival. They heard that Jesus was coming, and they get palm fronds, and they go out and begin to shout this great greeting, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of Israel. And then Jesus finds a donkey and rides it in, and this fulfills another scripture. So please scroll up so we can see the rest of that. Yeah, the scripture there is, fear not, daughter Zion. Look, your king comes to you riding on a donkey's colt. So that's a quotation from the prophet Zechariah. And then John says something fascinating. So what follows in italics is John's own words. And I put them in parentheses because he stopped the story to speak to us readers and say, look, here's what was going on. His disciples didn't understand what was going on. But when Jesus had been glorified, then they recalled what had happened to him and matched the things written about him. This is not the only place that John says this, but it's clear, it's obvious. He's saying it. It's not my theory. It's in the words of the gospel writers themselves, that at the time, they did not notice that this prophecy was being fulfilled. After his resurrection, after they came to the belief that he was the Messiah, they began to think about the prophecies. They began to think through them and read through them carefully to see which of these had he fulfilled And then they understood which of the things had, they were able then to make these correlations which were not evident at the time. There's another one of these. I didn't write it out, but you may know it in John's Gospel. When you can just stop here on the text here. That Jesus goes into the temple and throws out the people selling doves and changing money. And in John's Gospel, the temple authorities challenge him and say, "Well, what authority do you have to be doing this?" And Jesus says something very cryptic. He says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." Which to them is a very baffling statement. What on earth could that possibly mean? And then John tells us that he was speaking about the temple as his body, and after his resurrection, his disciples understood that that's what he had meant. So his words and deeds take on a new meaning after his death when they're read in the light of prophecy. So again, I want to emphasize that it's not that people noticed Jesus fulfilling prophecies and therefore thought he was the Messiah. It was the other way around. Once they came to believe that he was the Messiah, they began to make these correlations with prophecy and say, look, he fulfills this and he fulfills that. And it's a way in which they were able to sort of bolster their faith and give expression to their own belief that Jesus had been the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel. There's more to the story. It's a longer book. There's a lot of different ways in which these prophecies get moved around and dealt with, but I think this is a pretty good sampler in the time that we have.
How does Jesus get viewed in the context of prophecy from Paul, and how does that change when we get to the Gospels later?
Well, Paul, of course, isn't writing Gospels, so he's not coming up with specific deeds that Jesus did and matching them up, and he's not coming up with specific things Jesus said and matching them up. So Paul is talking in much broader terms, sort of abstractly, about Jesus being thus the Redeemer or the one who brings salvation to Israel. And some of the prophecies in Paul don't mention Jesus. They're, like I said, God tells you that God will be your father and you will be sons and daughters to him. So it's not the kind of specific, here's a story and here's the prophecy it fulfills. That's only going to happen when you're telling a narrative, and Paul doesn't do that.
When you look at Mark, the first gospel, and you go through all the way up to John, does it get more and more prophetic over time? Do they try to ascribe more and more prophecies to Jesus or connect Jesus to prophecies?
Yes, they do. I mean, you'll find, and the one who does this the most, of course, is Matthew. There's 14 times in Matthew's gospel where he stops the story and says, look, this was to fulfill the prophecy, and then he will quote it. So he's very direct, almost Pesher-like in that way, getting a specific text up to things like that. And Luke's gospel does it too, but Luke also will say more generic things, that Jesus fulfilled the scriptures and doesn't quote the specific ones that are being fulfilled. He does that sometimes, but sometimes it's more general. And then John has his own sense of these, but for sure, as more time rolled by, more and more of these correlations were made. And as we roll into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, past the time of the Gospels, the biblical scholars, the early Christian scholars come up with hundreds of these applications by which they make Jesus fulfill this or that prophecy in ways that even the gospel writers probably would have found rather strained. So once you get that impulse, just read your Old Testament and see what you can find, and make it work for you. Again, it can sound like I'm accusing them of dishonesty. I don't really know what was in their hearts or their minds. All I can do is read what they wrote. But I do know that everything that the gospel writers do to the prophecies for Jesus, other Jewish and Egyptian and Roman and Greek authors were doing with their ancient prophecies too. So there's no tactic or no specific process that is distinctive to the New Testament. Other writers, Jewish, Christian, Egyptian, Jewish, Roman, Egyptian, they retrofit, they quote it out of context, they do that stuff too. So this is simply the way in which people believed that prophecies were properly interpreted. I mean, if you had a book full of old prophecies from the past that referred to the past, that book would be useless to you. It just wouldn't have anything to say to your present. So why worry about it? And this is a way in which they could take an old book and make it speak to the present day, which is the task of every religious tradition, is to make their past come alive in their present. They can't simply repeat the past, because then it doesn't have much to say to people, and those religions that won't move in that direction tend to go extinct pretty quickly.
Could you talk about Justin's theory of the divine logos?
Yeah, Justin is an author from the late 2nd century. He's a very educated person. He was a philosopher before he became a Christian, so he's intellectual from head to toe. And he's got this fascinating theory about what he calls the logos, which is the Greek word that means word, but it also means reason. It also means message. It has a very broad range of meaning. And like other philosophers of his time who were pagan philosophers, Justin adopts this vocabulary of logos to mean that is the way in which God manifests God's will in the world, is through logos. We get our word logic from that too. So it has to do with, the gift of reasoning. And Justin had this fascinating, and I think just very odd theory, that every time in the Old Testament, when there is some kind of like the burning bush or some manifestation of God's presence, that actually is Jesus, who in John's gospel is called the Logos. And it's Jesus in a way that no one could perceive at the time, but that Jesus has been there. His voice, his Logos has been around before he came to earth in human form. And he was all the time sowing the seeds for the future Christian revelation. There's a whole chapter in my book about Justin. And I spent an entire summer reading Justin and soaking up his very prolific, and I want to say enthusiastic, way in which he interprets the prophecies of Israel, some of which I sort of criticized for him. I criticized him for them because he seems to use them in ways that he knows are not appropriate at times. But Justin is a convert. Many converts are very enthusiastic about their new faith, and he's pulling every resource he can find to make the case for the reasonableness of Christianity. And this is how he does it.
How does the Cairo Damascus document connect to all this?
Well, you'll have to give me some more clue on that. I mean, what? It's been a while since I've read that. What do you have in mind?
Well, some will bring up that the thing about the righteous teacher, and that he will rise again in 40 years after his death. There will be a future resurrection of the teacher. And so in the context of prophecy.
Yeah, that's of course, that would be, like we saw earlier with the Peshers, is the habit of the folks at the Dead Sea to read the entire Jewish scriptures as coming true in their own experience and pointing towards their leader and towards their revelation. And it's all extremely sectarian. And by that I mean it's very divisive. It means that we've got the truth. The rest of the Jews are completely missing the boat. And in fact, they're unrighteous, blah, 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 the way we see this happening in other forms of religion. In fact, one of the ways I describe the people at the Dead Sea rather, I hope it's not too flippant, but I describe them as Jehovah's Witnesses with PhDs. They're very smart, they're very studious, and they believe that they and only they understand the true religion of Israel, and everybody else is destined for some very bad end because they don't agree with the teacher of righteousness. And that they believed the end was coming soon, and they had a whole package of these very interesting and somewhat unusual and certainly non-mainstream beliefs. So it's not surprising that they would find predictions about the future glorification of their own teacher. But I don't think that has much to do with the New Testament, if at all.
Are Matthew and Luke, when they both use Mark, are they responding to Mark in a sense in the way that Mark uses and discusses prophecy? And what do you think about Matthew and Luke? Do you think they're independent and they both use Mark independently of each other, or do you subscribe to one of the alternative theories?
Yeah, I am not a specialist in the synoptic problem. I guess mostly because when I studied the standard solution, it seemed to make better sense than any of the others. So I haven't been participating in any of those very highly specific debates about it. But I always work with the assumption, it's not just an assumption, it's argued quite strenuously by a long history of scholarship that Mark is earliest, that Matthew and Luke are using Mark, but that Matthew and Luke are unaware of one another's work. That's what's called the two-source theory of the synoptic problem, and that's what I work with. And I see no reason, certainly when we come to prophecy, to think that Matthew or Luke, one of them is looking at each other's, because they have very different prophecies that they have Jesus fulfilling. I mean, for instance, the first time Jesus speaks in public in Luke's gospel is in the synagogue, and he reads from the prophet, I think it's Isaiah, and he says, "This is coming true right now as I'm saying it." So Isaiah is talking about me. Matthew knows nothing about this, so it's neither of them seems to be knowing what's going on in each other's work at that point. So they each do take Mark, they add to Mark, they see prophecies that Mark did not see. They pick up prophecies that Mark did see and find more in them than Mark claims to have seen too. So it's pretty clear that Matthew and Luke have been thinking about Mark's gospel very carefully and tuning it up, what we call redacting it, to be the source material for their own version of the story of Jesus. And prophecy plays a very strong role in both Matthew and Luke, although in Matthew we see much more of this overt, specific quotation of prophecies than we see in Luke.
Well, I think we can conclude there. Thanks for joining me today, Professor Miller.
Yeah. Okay, it's been fun. It's been fun for me. So thank you for the time, and I hope this is of interest to our listeners.
Thanks again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.